Hi there, my name is Ron Rogers, and this presentation is about TWA 841. Now, this has been the most requested accident incident that people would like me to investigate. And I know a lot of you have suggested this, and I've been slow to respond because basically I've been mulling over this for the last month. Now, a lot of the incidents that I cover are accidents that I'm familiar with to a degree, but I have to go back and do some research to make sure I have all my facts straight. And usually I get all my facts straight. Once in a while I make a little error there, but I try to get it right. But it entails a lot of research, and this one especially because this is a case where the board did not believe the flight crew as to what happened on this. So we all know about the 737 rudder incident where power control unit where the manufacturer Boeing was saying, nope, that can never happen. It's pilots stomping on the wrong rudder and stuff like that. They were just the most wild theories about what was going on, but the incident kept recurring, and that's one of the key things about this is the rudder incident kept recurring. They could not ignore it, kind of like the MAX problems with the flight controls. It occurred once, and then it occurred a second time, and that's part of the whole issue here. Now, this flight, TWA Flight 841, this occurred back in April 4th, 1979. I had not started my airline career, although I was preparing for it out at the Air Force. I decided to get out, so this was still very early in my airline career when this happened. But TWA Flight 841 was leaving John F. Kennedy International Airport, New York, JFK, and it's going to Minneapolis, St. Paul. Well, over Saginaw, Michigan, the 727 got into a little bit of a problem. They got into an uncommanded roll to the right. And the captain, Hoot Gibson, reported that he felt a high-frequency vibration in the balls of his feet, followed by a buzzing sound, and then followed by a steep roll to the right. As this occurred, he said that he shouted, "Get him up," and that's interesting because I never used myself that command in related to the 727, and he was referring supposedly to the co-pilot to get the speed brakes deployed. I would have called speed brakes. Get him up almost sounds like he's telling him to retract the flaps, but I mean, this was self-reported, so I doubt if he would have necessarily put himself into that position. But anyway, he started to lose control of the aircraft. Now, it's kind of interesting. He had control momentarily, and in the flight conditions, he should have been able to control the aircraft. They're doing 245 knots indicated at flight level 390, and he did maintain control temporarily. But then they speculate that he became distracted, either raising the speed brakes or, as the board supposes, he raised the flaps. And in that situation, the situation with the aircraft degenerated and he lost control, and he yelled, "We're going over." And they dove about 34,000 feet in 63 seconds, went through two 360-degree rolls, and at 15,000 feet, apparently he wasn't able to slow down using the speed brakes. He extended the landing gear and finally pulled out of the dive at about 5,000 feet. And by extending the gear at very high speed, it damaged the A system hydraulics. They were ruptured in this process. Now, one thing, before I digress, and I haven't digressed yet, and I'm not even sure if I will digress in this presentation, but I've had a lot of requests for people saying, hey, we'd like to see a I Digress t-shirt. So this is kind of the idea that my wife and daughter came up with, and hopefully produce some of these and figure out how to set up an online store and stuff like that. I'm working on that. That hopefully will come, but this is kind of a precursor to what may be going on. But now, back to the original story. Now, at the time, this was the lengthiest National Transportation Safety Board investigation of any accident. And they determined that the probable cause was a mechanical failure of the leading edge slat under inappropriate manipulation and the captain's untimely action. They determined the number 7 slat failed because it was extended while the aircraft was flying at cruise speeds, but it actually separated the aircraft in the dive. They were cruising at 0.816 Mach, which for a 27 isn't terribly fast. At 390, we go 82 or faster, so they weren't terribly high speed, but they were indicating 245 knots, and I'll show you that on the limits. That was actually within the limit speed of flap and slat, at least the first 2 degrees of flaps, which is where they supposedly set the. See, the idea was, some people thought that if you pull the circuit breaker on the leading edge devices and extend 2 degrees of flaps, you'll get better cruise performance. Okay, I don't know that this was ever flight tested in any respect. I know Boeing never flight tested any cruise performance like this, and for one reason, they never flight tested flap operation above 20,000 feet. And well, we don't really have any airports that I can think of offhand that are above 20,000 feet. That would be some really high altitude calculations. You'd have to have some pretty good performance. But Mach effects start to come in to effect at higher altitude. So if you're going to approve the operation, you have to flight test it. And if there's no reason to spend bucks flight testing something you're never going to do, you just say, hey, you can't do it above 20,000 feet. We didn't fly it up there. So, you know, it's not an operation that you can do. All right, so here's your standard drawing of the 727 with the various flight controls, etc. And the slat here is slat number 7. Now, if you go to the first flap setting of 2 degrees, you get slats 2, 3, 6, and 7. They deploy, and you get 2 degrees of trailing edge flaps. Now, from the flight manual, you've got your flap extended altitude there. I'm showing of 20,000 feet. And for flaps 2, 245 knots is the maximum extended speed. And they were actually just right at this. So as far as air loads ripping it off when they extended it, that wouldn't be an issue here. That occurred during the spiral dive. The actuator, and this is where I was looking to see if I could find anything of particular interest or something that may have been overlooked, but the NTSB was extremely thorough, as they usually are. But it's a fairly straightforward actuator, and I'll go on that in just a little more detail. And this is a picture of the leading edge slats and the what's known as Kruger flaps on the leading edge that also come out. And there's a little slat track there where the slats roll out. Now, this is the 737 PCU, Power Control Unit. And, of course, this has your secondary slide and just all sorts of slots and stuff. And this is the one where, you know, okay, it's an actuator. And they were blaming the crew, but it finally came to light that it wasn't the crew. They did have a problem, but of course the first reaction of everybody is to defend their own turf, and Boeing immediately put up the flags and go, nope, it's not our fault. And they did the same thing on the, of course, the 727 actuator. And this is a picture of the actuator. Now, it's fairly simple. And Boeing used the correct way to design these, where they have locking pins. It will lock retracted and it will lock extended. And it's also held in position, either extended or retracted, with 3,000 pounds of pressure. So it's locked and it's pressurized. So it's not going to typically move. Now, there was history of some inadvertent activations. They weren't terribly clear, but there was nothing that was more than, in the one case of the extension at 350 knots. I mean, this guy's smoking. That's something the 27 would do, and I've done that many times, gone fast. But he got an extension, because he thought the trailing edge flaps were slightly extended, so he was going to use the alternate flap system to retract it, which is kind of interesting. I guess, if the flaps are up, the hydraulic motor should have them retracted, but I guess he thought maybe the electrical motors on the flaps using the standby system were going to bring the flaps up if they were extended and the hydraulic system wasn't working. So here is your good old 727 hydraulic diagram there, and you see the main A system there, which operates a lot of devices, including the flaps, the leading edge and trailing edge devices, and it has the ability to extend or retract the leading edge devices and trailing edge devices. Now, the standby system there, the blue in the center there, it uses its own little reservoir off the B system, but all it does, it has the function where you can very slowly extend the trailing edge flaps, but you can also very slowly retract them. But as far as the leading edge devices, it just pumps fluid to the downside, and they come out slowly, a little bit asymmetrically, because they're not controlled as they are on the A system, and this has the standby system has lower flow, so it's a kind of a longer process. I'm getting them out, but the inadvertent extension was because they suspected that the captain either hit the switch the wrong way or the switch was wired backwards, and they replaced the switch. So I guess they thought that it was improperly wired, and when he was trying to retract, he actually hit the extension function, and he extended the leading edge devices at a high speed, and he had to slow down to get them to retract. Now, the only reference I could find to any issues with the locking rings on the actuators came out actually about 3 years earlier, and they were having some issues with these fracturing and causing either slow operation or intermittent operation. But whenever this fractured, the way the switch, the unlocked amber light is connected to the locking pins, whenever this occurred, you had a unsafe or an unlocked amber light indication. So part of the issue was if you had a problem with the locking pin and locking ring, you would have an amber light, and these guys never reported any amber lights. All right, now here's something that really got the captain in trouble with the NTSB, and I think he really ticked off the board by this, because he erased the cockpit voice recorder after landing. And of course, if you have an incident, you not only do not erase the CVR, but you also pull the circuit breakers to prevent it from overriding itself, because it'll override itself every 30 minutes. Now, part of the whole deal was the incident occurred more than 30 minutes earlier, so the whole thing leading up to it and the actual event would have been erased by just being overwritten. So the only thing that would have been on the tape was the crew discussing the situation afterwards. But if the crew had done something that they didn't want to necessarily reveal, then they would have talked about it possibly afterwards, got their story straight, and then decided to erase it. Now, in defense, back in the 70s, this was a different time. The NASA reporting system had only come out in 76, and a lot of people weren't even familiar with it, but it only lets you get a out of jail free card with the FAA if you had done something inadvertently. It was, trying to improve the system. We were going from a punitive environment to let's see if we can't make the system better. But you couldn't do an intentional violation, and putting the flaps out to 2 degrees would have been an intentional violation. So an ASR report wouldn't have helped him, and maybe this captain had such a habit pattern that he did it, this sort of thing. But you had thought after they landed at Detroit, unscheduled, after a extremely harrowing event, you had to think that he, it would have thrown him off his normal pattern of erasing the CVR. So this, I think really hurt the captain. Now, if he had a reason to erase it because there was stuff on that he didn't want the accident board to hear because it'd be incriminating, then he probably doesn't have much choice. But I think this really put him in a bad light and basically kind of screwed him over on getting much sympathy from the accident board. Now I'll talk about this in just a second, but basically three things would have had to fail. The locking pin would have had to fail, the hydraulic A-system pressure would have failed, and there's no evidence that there was any failure of the A-system hydraulic pressure or that the locking ring had failed, although the actuator was fractured. And the slat was never recovered. Like I mentioned, they were actually at 245 knots, which actually is the upper limit for extension of the slats in the flaps to configuration. But the other thing, even if the pressure had gone to zero, the locking pin had failed, there were still compressive loads. Now, there was an issue with a possible floating aileron, but that still wouldn't have done enough to allow the slats to extend. Now, supposedly, if you're above 0.8 Mach and you extend the speed brakes, the pressure flow changes due to that and due to the aerodynamic effects, and you could actually have the slat float out. But in this case, the air loads are pushing on the slat, keeping it retracted, even with no hydraulic pressure and no locking pins in place. Now, like I said, this was a very detailed report. And if that had a failure of the locking pins, one of the first things is that had that in-transit amber light on, and they didn't. They also looked at what's known as a transverse fracture of the actuator piston, and that would have permitted a maximum differential hydraulic pressure of about 780 pounds to act on the fractured face of the forward portion of the piston. Are you following along on this? This is from the accident report. This force could have extended the number 7 slat since it was slightly greater than the force produced by the air loads. Okay. However, calculations revealed that such a fracture in the area of the main piston seal indicated under normal operating load limits, which are predominantly axial, like that, a 11,300% margin of safety existed at the maximum strength. So this thing was very over-designed. It had various other conditions where it would take 70 more G's would be required to unlock the aft position. So the aerodynamic forces or G forces for this thing being over-designed, it just wouldn't occur. Also, in the retracted position, there were no forces acting on the piston that would have tended to produce a transverse fracture in the area of the locking keys. And then finally, they say in 16 years, and this is kind of the factor here, if this thing would have had more of a history, if this would have happened to somebody else, like on the PCU on the 737 rudder, they would have had a much better chance of talking their way out of this, or at least getting some support. And so basically, in all the time this airplane flying, in 16 years of service, 36 million flight hours, they had never had such a fracture of a actuator. So basically, the board came out with the probable cause that the captain manipulated the controls. There was a misalignment of slat number 7. So supposedly when the second officer came back in, he was absent from the cockpit. When he came back in, he saw the circuit breaker out for the leading edge devices, put it in, and boom, they extended. So when the captain tried to retract them because of the misalignment of number 7, it stayed out, and he subsequently lost control. He initially had control, but then was distracted for some reason, they think, and allowed the aircraft to depart controlled flight. Fighter guys know that one. And that led to the very horrible spiral dive. Now, the interesting thing is about this is they had one of the board members that disagreed with the final conclusions. He reluctantly agreed. But the thing that kind of ticked him off, and why I think the board had it against the captain and the crew. They didn't like the erasure of the CVR. They felt that was admitting guilt to a certain extent because they were trying to hide evidence. But they interviewed the crew right away. Now they had a lot of the flight test data, and they only later interviewed the second officer because they realized he had been out of the cockpit, I guess. But this one board member, McAdams, wanted him to interview the whole crew because now they had the flight test data, and he felt it would have been more appropriate to interview the whole crew, and that it was really inappropriate just to interview the second officer. So it's like, we don't want to hear from you guys. We don't want to give you a chance to defend yourselves. And like I said, it looks like the NTSB was just biased against the crew for the captain erasing the CVR, and it went downhill from there. But the evidence is there was no real way that this could have happened without crew intervention. There was just no failure mode. Often you will find some failure mode in an accident that you can go, yeah, that could have happened. But this was extensively looked at, and in all my time, I was 11 years on the 727. I flew all three seats, and I had never experienced an issue like this, or I had not known anybody else who experienced an issue like this. And unfortunately, this didn't result in a very good career for the captain. There were flight attendants who would refuse to fly with him, and he was a bit of a pariah. So not a good way to end your career. So that's it. This was a very difficult one because I was really trying to find some little bit of information where the crew would possibly have an out. There would possibly be something that would say, hey, there could have been an incident. There could have been a mechanical failure, but I couldn't find anything that points to it. And of course, this has been very thoroughly investigated, and there are some wild theories, but I don't think there's any true evidence that would point to redeeming the crew on this one, unfortunately. And I'm sorry to say that, but I think the accident board is right on this, but the captain sure didn't help himself. Anyway, I hope you found it informative, interesting, etc. Thanks for watching.